Hello.
Hi, Jack.
How are
Jack.
you?
How are you? I'm great.
I'm Jack Balkin, by the way, for those of you who are in the audience. I'm from Yale Law School.
So, and you're actually in New Haven right now?
I am. And you are?
I'm at Althouse, and I'm out here in Madison, Wisconsin, where it's a little cold, but sunny and snowy. Is it cold where you are?
No, it's rainy and drizzly and miserable.
Wow.
But you are bringing a little sunshine into my life.
I hope so.
All right. What are we going to talk about?
Well, I thought we kind of have to. Everybody's talking about Blagojevich, and I had to pause because I didn't want to say it wrong. But by now we're all supposed to know how to say it. Everyone's talking about Blagojevich.
Right.
So, what's going to happen to him? He can't really be impeached very easily, and he doesn't look like he's going to resign. So, what do you think the situation is?
So, so if you wait long enough, you can impeach him, but it'll take months. And he obviously wants leverage. That's why he's not resigning.
And he has supporters in the legislature who aren't ready to move on the impeachment, but it would take a long time even if they did. So I think it looks like impeachment is out, and he doesn't seem like the resigning type.
No, he doesn't seem like the kind of a blushing flower who will fade into the background. He obviously wants something, right? He wants something in return for resigning. And so I assume there'll be negotiations with him to try to figure out what that thing is.
He always wants something. That's right. It's another golden opportunity, and he's not going to do it for nothing.
Absolutely. Have you ever wanted, by the way, the Illinois Senate seat?
Wait, I can't say that again?
Would you like the Illinois Senate seat? Would that be something you would like?
No. I'm Wisconsin and Illinois are feuding, so as a Wisconsinite, I would be persona non grata in Illinois. But
I understand. But you could bring peace, finally, to all the warring sides. But in any case, it's available for about $50,000 for the Senate seat?
I thought it was up to $1 million.
Possibly. I was surprised at how low this seat could be gotten for.
I know.
Yeah.
Because it costs like $20 million to run for a Senate seat, right?
Exactly.
If you can just buy one, for even if $2 million would be cheap if you could buy it.
Right.
It's surprising that doesn't happen more often. Now, Blagojevich could appoint himself to the Senate. That would be an interesting move. What do you think of that?
It wouldn't work. It won't work. And the reason it won't work is because, by the way, what I told you about before about the camera and the camera changing its focus on me has just happened. So you see an expanding Balkin head here. But in any case, back to what you were saying.
Well, the better to think with.
The better to think with. In any case, the Senate, as you know, under Article 1, Section 5, I think it is, I don't have my Constitution right with me, says that each House is the judge of the qualifications of its members. So
That's right.
Reid has already stated, and the members of the Democratic caucus have already stated, that if Blagojevich appoints anyone to the Senate, much less himself, they'll refuse to accept the qualifications of that
But
person.
I thought under Powell v. McCormick that the qualifications only included the basic standing requirements like age and so on. They can't pile on other things.
Indeed, you are so good.
Right? They have to expel him.
They might
have to let him in and
then
then expel him. Isn't that what they would need to do? They'd have to let him in and then expel him.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's the argument he would make. I think what they would probably try to do is claim that they are permitted in cases where there's some corruption of the process to refuse to seat him. And the precedent for that would be, ironically enough, the precedent of expelling the Southern representatives and senators back in Reconstruction. Whether or not that would work, I don't know. But in other words, I think it's not clear, even given Powell versus McCormick, there's nothing they can do.
I think they should let him in and then expel him.
Yeah, well, yes. And that might take a little work.
Then they can do that, but they need a supermajority vote, which they would obviously have, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think so.
So he won't do that. He won't appoint himself because they won't let him stay. Even if they have to let him in, they won't let him stay.
Right.
But it looks like he can just hole up in the governor's office and do whatever he wants, and he'll get away with it. Well,
isn't there something in Article 5 of the Illinois Constitution that allows the displacement of a sitting governor by the lieutenant governor upon a showing of unfitness or temporary unfitness?
In the sense of...
it's like our 25th Amendment. It's like the U.S. 25th Amendment.
Doesn't that require a medical condition of some kind? I
I'm
haven't
not
looked
sure.
into Illinois.
I'm not sure. But if I were
because
advising them, what I would advise them to do is, the lieutenant governor says, I'm sorry, we've now determined that we don't think that Blagojevich is fit to hold office now for various reasons, and so we're displacing him temporarily. And during the time of the temporary displacement, then you appoint someone to the Senate, and then the folks from the Senate accept the appointment. In other words, they recognize qualifications. At that point, Blagojevich's leverage is almost all gone, don't you think?
I just find it hard to believe that that actually would work if he's got support in the state Senate and they're not moving in the state legislature and they're not moving to impeach him. That the idea that the lieutenant governor would successfully bump him when he's not, although there's a certain amount of talk that he is crazy. Have you noticed that in the press?
Since I deal with law professors all day, I don't have a good baseline of comparison for craziness.
There's a little bit of talk that's, I don't know where it got started, but it's a meme that he actually is insane, in which case it would seem that the unfitness would be there.
Yeah. Don't you think that another interpretation is he's just a particularly hard bargainer?
Yeah. I think there's not enough attention to that maybe people talk tough and say things like that in office, and maybe too much weight can't be given to that. I certainly don't think the fact that he uses the F word continually means anything. And the way Fitzgerald was sort of trying to shock the public by, with these quotes, the idea that would make a person unfit for office, I think that's absurd.
Yeah, you well remember the Nixon tapes, and every other word was expletive deleted. That didn't mean that Nixon was insane, although he was a paranoid man. It meant that he was a very angry man and bitter man, and he was also very shrewd. So my guess is, if I had to predict, they'll try to explore the temporary disability route, and they'll see if they can get enough votes for that, in which case they'll appoint them.
Interesting.
So that's what I would guess. But who knows? I'm not an expert in Illinois constitutional law.
Do you know anything about the lieutenant governor, whether this person, I don't even know if it's a male or a female, is the sort of person who would strong-arm the governor out of office like that?
I don't know.
It seems that takes a particular sort of a person.
But I would assume that lieutenant governor would probably be the odds-on favorite. I think that person is a Democrat, would be the odds-on favorite to replace Blagojevich, right? I mean, obviously, if he resigns, then the lieutenant governor becomes governor, but also it catapults them into the top ranks of Illinois politics.
Yeah, talk about this. That's self-dealing, too, isn't it? The idea that you can seize a position from someone else. I mean,
yeah,
that doesn't look too good either. It seems to me that whoever gets these positions that are going to open up, presumably the governorship, and obviously also the Senate seat, that person is going to want to be insulated from the taint that's gone before.
Absolutely.
Not part of it. In any way, they want to be completely above suspicion.
It has to be a person in Illinois politics who everyone agrees is qualified for the office and has no special ambitions. Now, one possibility is you pick a previous senator from Illinois who's retired. Another is you get some person who's regarded as, everyone regards as above suspicion. It's hard to find such people often in politics, but like a retired official is usually the choice. And because you're going to have... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just saying that would be good. I like the idea of someone who's above politics, if there are such people in Illinois.
Yeah. So you're also going to have a 2010 election. And one of the reasons to pick a person who's retired, right, is because it's unlikely they'll run in 2010. And that way you have the field open for everyone.
So put a sort of a placekeeper, and then they won't be someone who's in a position to run in 2010. They're just someone who will step aside and lets someone who can really get elected win the spot. That sounds good.
Yeah. So if I were the Democrats, what I would do is I'd say, well, who are the most recently retired Illinois senators, governors, people who have some stature, who are also Democrats,
and not in jail.
And not in jail.
Currently in jail.
Then you say you're going to be the caretaker senator for the next year and a half, and you promise you're not going to run, and you're going to essentially vote with the Democratic caucus, and that's the way it's handled.
Oh, but I don't like that idea that it's someone who actually is bereft of political power. He has no stature to deal with other senators. He's just an empty person. I don't think Illinois should want to be represented by someone like that.
Yeah, so perhaps I expressed myself poorly. What you want is you want somebody who is of sufficient stature that although you expect they're likely to vote with the caucus on most things, in fact, they have some independent judgment, and as a result of that, they'll actually stand up. Also, I think it's important because, as you know, this is the 58th vote in the Senate, and in practice, you're going to get a couple of moderate Republicans along. So if you move down to 57 or 56, now you really have consequences in terms of the legislative agenda for the new administration.
Well, I don't know that that's so bad. I like a little bit of a moderation and some brakes on the system. I'm a little afraid of them just being able to do whatever they want, except to the extent that it forces them to be responsible for everything that happens.
Yeah, remember, I'm talking now from the perspective of the Senate, the Democratic caucus. You're talking from the perspective of separation of powers.
Yeah. I don't want everything out of control. I like to see more friction. I like to see more brakes on the system. I don't want it just rolling along.
Yeah.
But also, I don't think Illinois should want a lame duck, an automatic lame duck senator. They should want someone with some clout. And but maybe there's no way to get anyone like that now. That whoever they get will have a mark on him.
If the person is a former senator or former governor of the state who has a good reputation, especially if they're a former senator, and they will already have connections with the existing members of the Senate, so they will have some influence, more influence than just you put a newcomer in there.
Now, do we know who the living former Democratic senators are?
Well, it's interesting because it's Carol Moseley Braun is the only one I remember. I'm trying to remember the others, and I'm sure people who comment on this blogging heads will say, well, Jack, don't you know it's the following people? But there is...
We could Google it if we wanted to Google in front of you, but we won't do that.
You won't do that and show me up. All right, there you are.
No, it also, I just think it might look tedious, but as long as your face is blowing up periodically.
It's blowing up right now, very slowly. It's blowing up.
Oh, then I might as well Google.
Yeah, you might as well. In any case, so that's Blagojevich. So what's the next thing on your mind?
We wanted to talk about the problem of the emoluments clause.
Oh,
and
yes.
Hillary Clinton getting the Secretary of State. And also, this related issue to me is the idea of whether Barack Obama is a natural-born citizen and qualified to be president, which was also an issue raised with respect to John McCain back during the campaign at some point because he was born in the canal zone.
Right.
And I'm just interested in the way people either do or don't take these provisions of the Constitution seriously. It seems to me ordinary, sane people don't take them seriously at all, but perhaps there's a problem with that. And I wonder what you thought about that.
You may remember in 2000 there was a controversy over whether or not Cheney was qualified to be vice president under the 12th Amendment because he can't be a resident of the same state as George W. Bush. And although he claimed to be a resident of Wyoming, in fact, he really lived in Texas, or at least most people thought that he lived in Texas.
Well, there actually was a lawsuit. I looked this up. It's very hard to, but it didn't. The people who brought the lawsuit were told they didn't have standing, but the district judge went ahead and reached the merits anyway, which is sort of like, why even bother to ask if they have standing, and if you're going to give an advisory opinion anyway. But he said it was a legitimate move to Wyoming. He moved back.
Yeah, the standard way of dismissing these lawsuits is not to go to the merits, but only to dismiss on the grounds of standing.
Right.
And the question you're asking is whether or not we should be more concerned and more angry about the fact that generally the judges tend to give these a wave of the hand, and the public generally doesn't pay very close attention to them.
No, I actually think it's right that the courts don't decide them. I really think the people don't have standing. I think it's one of these cases where the constitutional provision is interpreted somewhere else. But if the people don't care, I think that actually ends up kind of being the interpretation for all intents and purposes.
Right.
But
now,
some people who revere the Constitution get outraged when you say that.
Right.
Usually not lawyers.
So what you're saying is there's a distinction between people who revere the Constitution and lawyers. That's the key distinction we're drawing here.
I'm troubled by this. I think that laypersons look at a clause in the Constitution and say, well, that says something, words have meaning, the Constitution means something. You have to follow that whether you think it serves any purpose or not, whether it's too hard to amend the Constitution or not. You have to take that seriously.
I think that's correct, actually.
Right. And then I think lawyers and law professors tend more to, as I noticed reading on your blog, that Larry Tribe wrote a long piece explaining away the emoluments clause, and it seems to me that the sort of lawyerly way to do it is to say, well, that can't possibly be an obstacle, and let me figure out a way to tell you why.
Right.
And
now, you know that I also wrote a post on the blog before Larry did, in which I suggested that I thought, in fact, she was not qualified under the emoluments clause. And then in true lawyerly fashion, I said, well, what do I know? Here's the best argument on the other side. But, I mean, in my view
So you would disqualify her?
What's that?
You genuinely think she is disqualified, and the people who've gone before had the same problem? They really were disqualified. They were unconstitutional.
Yeah, I don't. In other words, the position I've taken after thinking about it is, if the text were genuinely ambiguous, you could have what's called the Saxby fix, in which you lower the salary to the point before the last increase, and then you treat that as the way to handle it. And if the text were genuinely ambiguous, then you, as a matter of construction, you can construe it to allow it.
Right.
But to me, the text didn't seem ambiguous. But I can see how somebody might disagree with me. But my ultimate conclusion was I didn't think it was permissible. Now,
right. If you look at it, we'll put the text up online, and I think if you look at it, it
really
is very
increased.
specific.
Yeah, the text. The key term is it has the salary shall have been increased during the term in which they're in office, and it is true that
the
her salary
term for
was
which they were elected. So that it's not going to be enough to say, well, I'll just resign my Senate seat and then I'll be appointed when I'm not a senator. That doesn't work. The text is written so that you can't do that.
And it's also right. And so the argument is, some people say, well, look, shall have been increased should really be read to mean shall have had a net increase.
So the cost of living is factored out. Is that the idea?
Yes, but also that you can raise it up and then you can lower it. So
that's the Saxby fix, the idea that, but then it shall have been increased, and then it shall have been also subsequently decreased.
Right. So that's the argument that I thought, in fact, was more powerful.
That's your argument.
Yeah, the text seems to say shall have been increased. It doesn't say shall have had a net increase.
Right.
And so that's the reason to believe that the text is not ambiguous. Now, the response to my argument is the following. Yes, but that's a very literalist reading. It doesn't seem to be connected to the purposes of the clause.
Right.
The purposes of the clause are to avoid corruption and sinecures. If the person, in fact, is willing to take a salary cut, there's no corruption problem, there's no sinecure. In which case, you should allow that. That's the argument. And I think it's the argument.
And that's a typical law professor argument. Right. I mean, that's what you hear amongst law professors all the time.
Also non-law professors, too.
Right.
I mean, it's just sort of a common sense style argument. And
I sort of think the common sense thing that you hear from people is just disbelief that something like that is going to stand in the way of doing what we want to do.
Right.
And then the other sort of layperson's argument is, the words say something, the words mean something, we have to follow them. But the sort of law professor view is to derive this purpose from it, and then use that to sort of vault over it in some tricky way, which is why people hate lawyers, I think.
There are many reasons why people hate lawyers. This may be one of them. I want to say that the idea, though, let me put it in a slightly different way. I'm going to be jurisprudential, and who knows whether you like it or not. So there are texts that appear to be ambiguous, and there are texts that don't appear to be ambiguous. Right. With respect to texts that don't appear to be ambiguous, no amount of appeal to purpose should be able to change the application of the text. Mm-hmm. If the purpose of 35-year-old president's requirement of 35 years is that the president be mature, or that, then no amount of maturity in a 22-year-old is going to make him qualified for being president. Right. Because the text is not ambiguous, and it's not vague, which is two different. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you think it is ambiguous or vague, then you can look to purpose. And the debate in the emoluments clause is the text vague? And my view is it's neither vague nor ambiguous. And what Tribe and others are claiming is that in my view, they're manufacturing ambiguity.
Right, exactly.
Which I don't think
that's the problem that I have. It's sort of like, if it's ambiguous, we can change it. And then the question is, well, do we want to change it? Then we need to find it to be ambiguous.
So
it looks like bending over backwards, looking for ambiguity. I think that is what people find troubling. I mean, but what do you think of this idea that if there's a constitutional problem and you can't adjudicate it in courts, it really is sort of presented to the people. And if the people don't object to it, for example, if there's an idea that maybe Barack Obama or John McCain aren't natural-born citizens as required by the
Let's just take Arnold Schwarzenegger. Let's just take a
well,
clear case.
Let me work to Arnold Schwarzenegger. With respect to them, it's sort of a subtle question and it's kind of perplexing. But people have decided to go ahead and vote for them, and they're not talking about it very much, except on the very fringe. There's a sense in which the people have essentially interpreted the Constitution with respect to what that clause means. But with respect to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's obviously not a natural-born citizen, and there's just no argument that he is.
Yeah.
If he were to run for president, well, you could say, well, if everybody just didn't care about it and voted for him anyway, then kind of he could be president. But the fact is that the people wouldn't accept that. People wouldn't tolerate him running for president unless the Constitution were amended. So that's sort of the idea that the people's interpretation actually is sufficient.
So it's an interesting way of putting it. I would have put it slightly differently. Neither Obama nor McCain was in the same position as Schwarzenegger because most people didn't believe that they were born outside the United States. Most people believe, or that they were natural-born citizens. Most people believe they were natural-born citizens. And they believed people who claim the opposite just to be making up stories. Hence, they didn't think that there was a choice between what they wanted and what the Constitution said. In Schwarzenegger's case, however, a clear choice would be presented. And that's why that one strikes me as more interesting for your thesis.
So, do you agree with me that he just couldn't get elected, that people would stand by the Constitution to the point where they wouldn't tolerate him being the candidate or voting for him, that they would
I think so.
act
I
on
tend to agree with you.
without
imagine,
a court doing anything?
The only thing I can imagine is, here's the only scenario I can imagine, and I just don't think it would happen. There's an emergency of some type, a really serious emergency, and it becomes clear to the public there's only one person who could possibly get us out of the emergency, and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so people go, who cares? But I just can't imagine that situation. A closer example that's closer to what you're concerned with is getting around the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment, as you know, for the audience, says you can't be president more than twice.
Right.
So imagine what happens.
We need Bill.
What's
we
that?
need Bill Clinton back. We need Bill Clinton back. So
Right.
there's a way to get him back, right?
And so imagine what happens is that we need, there's a terrible emergency and nobody has any confidence in anyone except for a former president. Or imagine that the emergency happens on the very last month of the president's term, or it happens, say, in the election year, and everyone says, you got to run for a third term because there's nobody in your party who can do the job that you can do. And he says, okay, well, forget the 22nd Amendment. I'm going to run. But I really think that in that case, you really are doing something that's that's pretty close to demagoguery, and I wouldn't like it at all.
Yeah, and it would come down to Congress would have to stand in. If people voted for him and then the Electoral College voted for him, then it would eventually end up in Congress, right?
Congress could refuse to accept the votes of the Electoral College.
And they could refuse to accept it, and then whatever they did would be the last call.
Yes,
right?
and what you're saying, in other words, is that there are lots of constitutional controversies, even ones that seem to be based on clear language, that are ultimately resolved through the political process.
Or there are sometimes political actors who play the role of interpreting the Constitution. It's not that they get to do whatever they want politically. It's that the Constitution is entrusted to them to make the judgment. And if they make some crazy judgment about what it means, it's really just like the times when the court makes some crazy judgment about what the Constitution means, and that's the last call, and that would be the answer.
Not
that wouldn't be upsetting, but I think that happens on things that are more ambiguous a lot of the time, so that if on one of these clear things it ever happened, that really would be the answer, and we would move on from there.
Well, not to wax jurisprudential here, but this is what I do. It actually turns out that if you look closely at the way the American system of constitutional decision-making works, that's the standard case. The standard case is that public opinion changes its mind about the meaning of a vague clause like equal protection or due process or searches and seizures or freedom of speech, and courts ultimately ratify those views in doctrine. So in fact, it turns out courts really don't have the last word. The people always have the last word, and the courts sort of ratify it.
Right.
That's
Obviously,
my
you can.
view.
I mean, a lot of people say that. I think you said that probably more strongly than I would want to say that. The idea that the court just follows along with with what the people want. I think the people are contributing to trying to understand the document. They're not just getting their political will. So I think that you have. I want to see an element of the people actually care about the Constitution. They're trying to interpret it, and their idea of what it means is counting for something, like with the Second Amendment this summer.
Well, I think it's a perfect example. Perfect example, then, in which you have a view, really from the New Deal forward. Really, I'd say really from the 20s or 30s forward, that the Second Amendment doesn't protect any individual rights. And what happens is a social movement develops starting really after the 68 assassinations and the creation of a National Firearms Act, which leads to a counter-mobilization, and that counter-mobilization is the gun rights movement, as we know today. And that movement eventually convinces so many Americans that the Second Amendment protects an individual right that we see the court protecting it through the guise, by the way, of originalism. I mean, they use the language originalism. But what they're really doing is reflecting a strongly held public sentiment that the right to bear arms includes an individual right.
So, I think part of what rights are includes what we think they really should be, but it's not just pure political will. It is that we're interacting, the people generally are interacting with the Constitution itself, and they're concerned with what it actually means, and they're being convinced by some arguments. And it's a different sort of enterprise that is healthy and good, so I approve of that, as long as they don't go too far and just decide that they can vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger for president.
So you approve of this message?
Yeah, do you think that's that I'm being a critical legal studies radical?
No, actually I don't. I think you're in line. I think you're in line with a large group, well, not a large group, but I think an influential group of political scientists and law professors, of whom I am one, that really looks strongly to the political environment in which courts operate as a way of understanding why courts decide cases the way they do.
Yeah. And I don't have a problem with the fact that not everything could go into courts, and the idea that things must be done in courts, and that it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't get into court. I have a problem with people who won't accept that that's true.
Yeah. Well, I'd be willing to say that a very significant percentage of constitutional questions never make their way into court. They're resolved outside the courts.
Yeah. Right. And there are just many things that people agree on to the point that they don't even have to ask.
So,
hey, let me segue into the issue of can I move to a new topic?
I
didn't mean to cut you off. I cut you off. Go ahead. Oh,
That's
I was
all
going to
right.
say, I saw this article in Politico, I guess it was a couple weeks ago, about Obama skipping church and Obama not going to church, and there being an issue of whether that it's become sort of a public issue. Whether Obama is religious enough, whether he should be going to church. I mean, a lot of people sit and wonder about themselves. Well, should I be going to church, or should I be going to some sort of worship service?
Right.
But the idea that we have an interest in like spying on the president and determining whether he's meeting his religious responsibilities, I think is a rather odd one. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I could approach it from a sort of indirect, and then I wonder what you think of what I'm going to say. So the American system is very interesting in that it combines head of government with head of state. So we don't have a separate prime minister and a king. What we have is a president, and the president performs both the functions of head of government, that is, he's the executive, head of the executive branch, and he's also the symbolic head of America. He symbolizes America. And so when you have a system like that, people tend to expect that the president will somehow be better than them, will be a role model, will behave in a very dispassionate and appropriate way. He'll be like a model citizen in all respects. And that leads them to think, well, since a really good person is a religious person, not everyone thinks that, but some people do, then they'll think, well, he ought to be a religious person. He ought to talk about God a lot, and he ought to go to church. And if he doesn't go to church, well, he's not living up to his duties as head of state. And this is, in some sense, I think it's unfortunate that the United States picked this model. I think, a lot of the features of American politics might be very different if we had a person who was called the head of state, right? Ceremonial head of state.
Is that what you're saying? You wish we had a king?
No, not a king, because we're a republic, not a monarchy. And there are many, many republics that have presidents They're called presidents, and whose job is different than the prime minister. The prime minister is the head of government, and the president is the head of state. Now, our head of government is called a president. I don't want to change the title of that. But think of something else. Just call the person head of state. And his ceremonial function is to represent the United States and to symbolize the United States. And in certain moments of crisis, you turn to him because he's a respected person in order to handle certain kinds of issues. And
well, why don't we just use the vice president for that? He has no work.
Yes, I mean, it's
He
very
goes to the
interesting
funerals,
that
so
we
isn't
flip
he
it.
sort of-
Yeah, that we flipped it in a sense that the vice president is sitting around not doing very much until we got to this one.
He could be our pious representative if that's what you want. But now, well, the thing about Obama in church to me is that he jumped through all the hoops in moving toward president and getting his political position in Chicago. He joined a church to be politically connected. Of course, that led him into some troubles, and then he distanced himself from that. But he participated in the Saddleback Forum during the campaign, going through this hour-long interview with Reverend Rick Warren. He mentions God quite frequently. He uses religion skillfully. I think he takes Abraham Lincoln as a model. And there is this classic sort of ceremonial deism kind of way that presidents use religion. And he does all of those things. So he sort of knows the game, and he does it. So he uses religion. And you might say, great, we actually want a president to use religion. If he actually were seriously religious, that would be a problem. What we want is someone who can gracefully wield these sort of theatrics of religion.
Could you expand on that?
And he's very good at that.
Could you expand on that? You just said something very interesting, and I wanted you to expand on it. It would actually, it's good that he gives lip service to religion, but it would not be good if he actually sincerely was very religious.
Right, and I don't think he is. I mean, if I had to take a bet, I would say he is not
Could you
religious
expand
at all.
on why that's the case? Could you expand
Why
on
I think it's good?
Yeah,
Or why I think he's
why it
not
would be better for the president to pay lip service to religion rather than actually be religious?
Because if he was religious, he would belong to a particular sect, and he would have particular beliefs that might affect his judgment in ways that aren't about the general public good, and he might have some conflicting pulls on what he can do in different situations. It might affect his judgment in ways that could be good but could be bad, and it make some people feel that, they got their guy in instead of some other person. There's a Catholic president or there's a Methodist president or whatever, and there's a special tie to a particular group. I think a sort of a generic religion of the sort that the religion would turn into it if we had an established religion, just something sort of generic and theistic and useful for the sort of theatrics and making people feel comforted in times of need and so forth. I think that is a graceful, appropriate thing that a president could do. And if he were seriously religious, who knows what he might do, And I think that many intelligent people aren't religious. I think there are many atheists who hide the fact that they're atheists. I don't know that that's good, but I think a president who actually isn't very religious but respects religion and uses religion in a way that serves the public needs and doesn't really make anyone feel excluded is kind of doing the best thing. I actually think that's what Obama does. So,
well, I'm a little troubled by that. I'm a little troubled by that account. But you might convince me otherwise. Here are the things that trouble me. One is I'm not sure that it's appropriate to use religion as a prop, even if for a noble purpose. If you're, it seems like religion is being treated entirely instrumentally in this account. The second thing I'm worried about is. So,
do you have a religious objection to that?
Well, let me just tell you all my objections, and then we can characterize them. The second is I don't really have a problem with presidents or senators or anyone being people of deep faith, religious faith. I have no problem at all. I think it's just fine. I have no problem with them being atheists or agnostics either. If they have a strong spiritual life and if they're religious, that's fine. In their public behavior, especially if they're a national figure, they have to be careful to hold themselves in a way so that people of all faiths and people who are atheists and agnostics can recognize them as playing fair among all the different denominations and beliefs, so that they don't fall into the danger that you were talking about. That is to say that they're motivated because of their faith to try to impose a particular religious conception on the rest of the country. But I distinguish that from being a person of deep beliefs or being of having religious beliefs. So,
Yeah.
and then the last thing I want to say, which is not really, I'm not disturbed at what you're saying. I'm rather more disturbed about the nature of the culture in the United States, which is, I think that if a person came to the settled conviction that they were an atheist or an agnostic, and they announced this with the same degree of seriousness and forcefulness as politicians announced their deep commitment to faith, I think they would disqualify themselves from federal or state offices. That is to say, they would never be able to be elected. And that is deeply troubling to me. Not because of what you've said, because, right? But rather because
obviously
I think
I agree with you on that point. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think an atheist, the idea that people reject atheists more than any other group when it comes to being president, I think that's absurd, and it's partly caused by the fact that so many people are motivated to hide it. I think if you are, some people love to flaunt being an atheist, but I think most people who are atheists just go about doing whatever they would do otherwise, and they save all the time they would otherwise devote to religion, and they let other people do that, and they are tolerant. So I think there are many people in politics who have that set of beliefs, but they wisely don't talk about it any more than they would talk about the fact that they like pornography or something like that. Just not, it doesn't help. It doesn't help their cause.
So
I don't think that that's good.
Do you think perhaps there are more closeted atheists than closeted gays in America? I don't know.
Probably, yeah. Well, I mean, it depends on how you define atheism. I think there are a lot of people who would serve as this kind of a ceremonial deist president that I'm describing, who might not say that they're atheists. They might say they're agnostics, or they might be, in a lukewarm way, following whatever the traditional religion of their ancestors was. But it doesn't play any role in how they make decisions or how they feel about anything, and it's sort of a social thing. Right. I just think there are a lot of people in that category. Sure, I assume a large proportion of Americans feel that way. But if they want to go into politics, they don't say it. I think that's a shame. Now, on your 3 points, I think your first one was saying that it's sort of offensive that the person would be hypocritical to use religion, like to say, God bless America, if he wasn't really asking God to bless America. I don't have a problem with that kind of
Well, I wasn't saying it
flourish.
that way. I was rather saying that we shouldn't say that it's appropriate for people to manipulate others through the pretense of religion. And perhaps what you're saying is, what you're describing isn't manipulation at all. It's just modus vivendi, getting along with people.
Yeah, and just creating a shared feeling like you would about kind of patriotic values also. I mean, you might not think, America has done a lot of bad things, but you don't say, God damn America and all of that sort of thing, right? Because it just doesn't work very well, and it's not the kind of feeling you're trying to create. Now, I think Barack Obama is really using rhetoric and speech to try to create feelings in people and to create a positive spirit about things. He frequently uses religious ideas in that, and I don't think that they're necessarily sincere on a real religious belief level, but I wouldn't say that he's doing something offensive or wrong or
if you believe that what he's doing is not sincere, could you understand why people of sincere religious faith would be very upset by his doing it?
Really extreme religious people might have a problem with that. But I think a lot of people would say, look, I understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to govern all of us. Most of us have one religion or another, and so to use the language of religion is effective and helpful, and he's trying to be helpful, and that's God's work whether he's religious or not. Something like that, I think that's what I would say. Yeah. I think that's the sort of moderate religious position. While some people would say, don't invoke God's name in vain, don't say God if you're not really talking about God. And I could see being that kind of really strong religionist, but I wouldn't condemn a politician.
But I take it there's some kinds of manipulations of religion that you don't agree with. That is, people who use religion as a method of excluding others, say, from being genuine Americans or something like that.
Right. And then what I'm describing is really the opposite of that. It's being inclusive. I know it offends the freedom from religion people. So there's some people who think, no, you have to expunge all religious references from your speech. I sort of think that if people who aren't that religious went ahead and used this kind of ceremonial deism form of religion speak, that it wouldn't feel that exclusionary to most people, unless they really just hated religion. You know, we understand that we just like we might talk about nature and see nature as being embodied. We don't really think that there's a spirit of nature when we talk about the beauty of nature, and people just deal with that. So I think that the religious references could be handled in a tolerant way like that.
Okay, and the second point. The second point is that I thought that there's nothing wrong with being a national leader of deep religious feeling, as long as you treat non-religious co-religionists as equal citizens. And I
agree with that.
Yeah, but
no, I agree that you can have the deep religious faith. I mean, I think that I think Bush has it. Did you think Clinton was deeply religious?
Yeah, he strikes me as a man of deep religious faith who continually sins, and then is sorry about sinning, and then pledges to redeem himself, and then he goes out and sins again. It sounds. Yeah. I mean, the more religious he is, the more he sins. I mean, it's not. They're actually correlated.
Well, I don't know. It's considered in bad taste, I think, to judge other people's religion. If they say they're religious, you're supposed to believe them. Who knows whether they're... Well, Joe Lieberman, he's someone who's clearly deeply religious, right?
But the point I wanted to make about Clinton was simply that the fact that one is deeply religious tells you nothing about whether the person is engaged in sin or whether they do bad things.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Because the religion stands as a critique of your actions. So you might you might have deeply internalized the idea that what you're doing is wrong, but you don't feel you can help yourself. And in fact, the guilt actually may be a motivator in certain other kinds of ways.
But religion can also cause you to do some things that are wrong. I mean, you also have the problem that you're doing wrong things because of your religious beliefs, and people do that too. At least if you don't have religious beliefs, you don't have that particular problem.
Right.
The idea that people who aren't religious don't have the same feeling that they're doing something wrong when they do something wrong. I think that they at least have more reason-based ideas about what's right and wrong. So that's why I was saying that the non-religious person might be a better political leader. But I'm certainly not going to exclude the people with deep religious faith. I think those people are fine too. But obviously, I also agree with you that they need to make it, more generic and broad when they speak to people. If they use it, or they could not speak about it at all. Obviously, some religious people don't bring it forward in public at all, and that's their style.
I just want to summarize part of what you and I were talking about.
Okay.
There's a certain sense in which the public exercise of religion in the public sphere by a leader is an exercise of diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And with both the good and the bad things that come with the use of the term diplomacy, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right, yeah, right, I see.
That there's always you're not partly telling them everything, but you're trying to smooth things over. You're trying to get people to behave appropriately and together, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of diplomacy in it, and I think it's a very difficult set of lines to draw. And the best politicians, and I mean this not simply most skillful, but the best politicians, the ones we look up to, are the ones who are able to manage it the best, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And it's probably true of Obama, don't you think?
We will see.
Do you agree with me that Obama's probably an atheist?
I don't know. I don't know what his religious beliefs are.
Do you think it's wrong to talk about that?
No, it's not wrong to talk about it.
Well, some people think if someone says they're religious, you're supposed to just accept it. There's just there's no good in doubting it. Whatever they say they are, that's what they are for public purposes.
Well, okay, I understand that idea, but I have, there are a lot of things that people say are true about them that turn out not to be true about them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the best way to figure out whether they're true or not is to see what they do in practice and how they hold themselves and what they say.
Which is the opposite, but with like Bill Clinton, it was sort of like, well, if he's sinning, that isn't inconsistent with his being religious. So his behavior offending the precepts of his religion, that's not evidence that he's not religious. That could be evidence that he is religious.
Right. Well, the example I was thinking is, you'll have to remind me, the evangelical preacher who a couple of years ago, it was discovered he had a gay affair, which he had vociferously denied, but then later said, yes, it was true, and then he went into counseling, and then he was trying to be rehabilitated. I'm blanking on his name, but I'm sure
You know,
you know.
I don't want to get. I think I know who it is, but if I say it and it's the wrong guy,
Right. Anyway, but to use this example, I had no doubt that throughout this entire story, this was a man of deep religious faith who was horrified about what he had done, even though I don't think he should be horrified, because I don't think there's anything wrong with being homosexual. But he had convinced himself that what he was doing was horrifying. And he kept doing it. He couldn't stop himself from doing it. And this was explained, he explained it to himself in terms of notions of sin and fallenness. And so his entire experience was routed through his religious beliefs. Even the whole idea of what it meant to be redeemed was routed through his religious beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's pretty. But although he did have some financial interests in being perceived as having that religion, so the idea that what he wanted to do and what he was constraining himself with could only have been religion because nothing else would have explained it. It could have been his financial interests or some other, or social connections, things like that. There are possible other things that could explain it.
Right. Well, our motivations are often very complicated.
You know, on this subject of closeting, closeted atheists and religious people who are closeted homosexuals, we were going to talk about Proposition 8.
Indeed we were, and I wanted to know what your view is about both the Proposition 8, the election, and also the response to it, which is very interesting to me.
I have a huge problem with the response. I think we're going through a period of social ferment and change, and we have to get along and live through it. And the idea that people who didn't get what they wanted today are going to just start calling other people bigots and launch focused attacks on particular churches, the Mormon Church, I just don't see that working out well at all. I think you have to live through this period of change and give people reason to want to change things. So, I mean, I would have, if I was in California, I would have voted against Proposition 8, which banned gay marriage in California. But I don't like the reaction to it. I mean, people just aren't ready for this to happen yet, but maybe you think the courts should push them over the edge, and that.
Well, my own view is I don't think the California Supreme Court should overturn Proposition 8. I know a little bit about the governing law here and under what conditions they can do it. And as I understand the law, I don't think that the opponents of Prop 8 have a great case. I mean, there are some arguments they can make, but I don't
you're
think
talking about the validity of Prop 8 as
right,
opposed
the validity
to
of Prop 8.
protests. Yeah.
My view is that if
that
Prop 8 is repealed, it'll be repealed through a subsequent amendment by the people of California. And I would support such an amendment that overturned Prop 8 because I think that the people of a state people of California should protect the right of gays to marry, but it should be done legislatively. And now it will have to be done through the amendment process.
And what about the people who got married in the interim? What happens to them?
Well, my own personal policy preference is that they should be grandfathered in, and I don't actually know how the amendment will be interpreted with respect to them. I mean, there's one interpretation of the language of the amendment that says since marriage is defined as X and they don't meet the definition, by definition they can no longer be married. But I don't think it follows necessarily in interpreting the new amendment that grandfathering in doesn't have to occur. I mean, there are lots of situations in which statutes seem to be clear on their face, but we make exceptions, grandfathered exceptions. So I think it's perfectly...
Do you think that there's a federal claim that it violates due process to take away the marriage after it was granted?
There is a kind of destruction of vested rights claim that could be made under the Fifth Amendment. I don't think it would succeed, but now that you raise it, I can see exactly how you would make the claim.
Now, why do you think it wouldn't succeed? I mean, people who they were married under the law as it was, and then the law was changed and their marriage was taken away from them. They had a legal status, and it was taken away from them. Now, some people think that the solution on gay marriage is to get rid of marriage as a legal thing, have it just be purely religious, and then have civil unions as the only legal thing.
Yeah.
But that would raise the same problem. You have people who are legally married, and then you would be telling them they're not legally married.
If you wanted to go for that compromise, which I think is not a bad compromise, the way you would do it is you just grandfather in all couples who have been married up to a certain date, and then after that what you get is you get a civil union, and then you can't claim that something that you had was taken away from you.
So you wouldn't take, everybody already married would stay married, and it was just nobody could get married in the future.
Yeah, that's what I would do if I were going to go for that kind of compromise. I mean, the argument, the constitutional argument that you are raising here, so I can spell it out for the audience, goes something like this. Marriage is not only a status, it's also a set of property relations. The property relations are being abolished by law. And they're being abolished in a way, and it's sort of like it's destroying your property. What's that? Yeah.
So why isn't that a good argument? Why
it's not a bad argument, but generally speaking, if the government passes a new regulation of the environment, say, which has a significant effect on property rights, it by itself doesn't mean we have a Fifth Amendment violation.
But at some point it does. At some point it does.
At some point it does. At some point a regulatory taking can be so severe that, in fact, it violates the Fifth Amendment. So, ironically, the fact that California had already granted a significant number of property rights and entitlements to domestic partnerships, and so that what was being added was a relatively small number of additional rights, undercuts the Fifth Amendment argument.
So if they're all just downgraded to civil unions,
well, in California, they're downgraded to domestic partnerships.
So, and then it would be like those property rights cases where there's regulation, but it doesn't take away your whole use of the property. It just costs you money. It limits what you can do.
Right. And that's the irony. See, the thing that's so interesting about the California case is that the California Supreme Court case said, look, you've already granted almost all of the rights of marriage through the Domestic Partnership Act. And why do you keep out the 5 or 6 extras that are left plus the name marriage? This seems irrational to us. And that's essentially
it's just to express hostility. So it's like those equal protection cases where you say this is only to express antagonism and hostility and malice toward a group of people.
Right.
It serves no other purpose.
I actually think that I wouldn't put it in terms of malice and hostility. I think that's the adoption cases. You know, a statute says gays can't adopt. I think it's much closer to say that that's the reason for it, and then you strike it down for that. But in the case of marriage, I think it's much more likely that that the opponents of gay marriage want to preserve the superior moral status of heterosexual marriage, and that's what they're trying. That's why they don't want to use the word marriage.
It would be a very important step toward normalizing homosexuality so that you wouldn't be able to treat gay people unequally, and people want to preserve the right to be able to do that. They don't want the schools to be teaching that all of these arrangements are equally good and everybody is good and all of these things are equally. And so the concern is that that's the big leap, and once that's made, then everything else will be leveraged in, and we need to stop that. That's why I think people are so adamant about. And I support gay marriage, but I'm just saying I think I understand why people are why that one step is so important to people, because there's such huge symbolism. If those people are able to be married, then how can you disrespect them in any way? And how can you teach children? Or it's just bigotry.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you put it that way. I tend to agree. Back in '97, I wrote an article called The Constitution of Status. And the argument in that article was essentially that these debates often are conflicts about status hierarchy. That is, who is superior to who else, and how do you show that you're superior to somebody else? And it's kind of a zero-sum game. I have this degree of status, and if you have the equal amount, then I don't have the benefit of status of a greater status. And so it turns out these are incredibly bitter conflicts often. But in fact, it's not clear that there's any natural point at which you can say, yes, we've achieved normalcy. So you could have made that same argument about keeping anti-sodomy statutes on the books but not enforcing them. Well, we've got to keep the statute on the books just to say that this is immoral conduct, even if we don't enforce it. Well, that got thrown out. Now, all right, well, we've got to make sure that there is no equality in the workplace. In a lot of states like California, that's out. And then the next step is just adoption and now marriage. And at each point, it's like the Maginot Line, right? If they cross this, now we know these are equal morally. But I don't think that even after you have gay marriage in a state, you will find everyone agreeing that it's just as good to be gay as it is to be straight. What you'll get is fights over the educational curriculum, as you said.
I think people fight over each line, but you're right. Lines have already been crossed, and at some point you might say, "Oh, quit fighting over the next line. You've already lost at those other lines, so your fight isn't worth fighting anymore."
Right, but I think that one of the things that's so interesting about the fight over gay rights in America is that even as things become decriminalized and normalized, and the law treats people as equal citizens, which is, I think, the way they should, you will still have private beliefs. Often based on religion, but sometimes not based on religion, that no matter what the law says, it's this person's opinion that it's not as good to be, being heterosexual is better morally than being homosexual.
I think that people they don't want to be stigmatized as bigoted. Obviously, gay people don't want to be stigmatized as bad, but the people who want to think it's wrong to be homosexual don't want to be stigmatized as bigots. So that's why they're fighting. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I understand how the people with religious beliefs who want to be able to adhere to them, and they want to be able to, hire and fire and make decisions about various. So I just think they're trying to. They're maybe asking for something that you can't have. You can't make people think you're good if you believe things that they find hateful. But I think that there's a human desire to preserve respect and good standing. But to do it by denying rights to other people, it's not very attractive. So, to me, it's just compounding bigotry with a willingness to victimize other people, which only makes it worse.
My own sense of what's going on is that although we tend to think of religious belief as referring to eternal truths that don't change, and that's why they're eternal, that every religion I know of, at least the ones I know of in the United States, has changed its views with respect to concrete controversies over long periods of time. Yeah. And that what you are likely to see is that people's views about the morality of homosexuality is likely to undergo some change, even though they're making judgments based on their religious beliefs. Because, in fact, religion is an extremely durable and yet flexible way of trying to apprehend what's good and what's bad in the world. In fact, its durability comes from its ultimate flexibility.
Yeah.
Now, speaking from inside a religion, it's hard to talk that way. Speaking from outside of religion, you can see how different denominations of Christianity in the United States changed their views over time about slavery, and then changed their views about women's position, and changed their views about racial equality. And I suspect many of them will also change their views eventually about homosexuality. Right. But, it's not like you can turn to a religious person and say, don't you see your church has changed all your positions all these times? Because that's just not a good argument from within a religion.
The proof that you're religious is that you're willing to adhere to those rules, even though you want to personally question them. It's as if So, it's very hard to make that argument to people.
What has to happen is that within the terms of your own religion, that is the theology of your own religion, it becomes clear to you that what God wants, or what justice is from God's perspective, it says that this is wrong. This is a wrong form of discrimination. This is not treating people as equal as God's children. And then at that point,
revelation.
It changes. It just changes over time. But that's internal to religion in some sense.
Right. Like the Mormons got the additional revelation that they didn't need to be polygamists when they had to abandon that for legal reasons. They got the revelation.
Well, that was in a very short period of time, but the things that I'm talking about here occur over very long periods of time, and they're not only waged on the outside, that is to say from the standpoint of society criticizing the religion, they're also waged within the context of the religion itself. And people's debating with each other in good faith, seriously, about what the religion means in a contemporary context.
Yeah, and I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy that there are these subgroups, that they have their own interpretations, their own valued texts, and that they look for the good in a decentralized way. I think that strengthens the whole in certain ways.
Well, all right.
Good.
So we
at its best.
I think we have a lot more we could talk about, but I think we'll probably save it for the next time. And I've enjoyed very much talking to you. It's been a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Okay, yes, you're right. We have gone over an hour, so let's say goodbye then.
All right, we'll do it another time. Thanks very much.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.